To share my screen, if I may, and then we can all see the presentation. Okay, so my apologies, the presentation is in English, but hopefully some of you will, or all of you will understand what I'm saying. The presentation is on vulnerable victims adopting a trauma-informed approach. Now, just a little bit about myself, if I may, for a moment. I'm a retired police officer from London. I served for 31 years working for Scotland Yard, and I have a history of investigating human trafficking, protecting vulnerable people, dealing with community policing, and similar issues. Since retiring, I've assisted and taught on behalf of the OSCE, UNODC, and the like on this very subject. Now, a trauma-informed approach. This may be something that some of you have heard of, you may well be aware of. But I've recently heard a lot of professionals, bosses, and even government ministers say that they adopt a trauma-informed approach, or we need to adopt a trauma-informed approach. Well, what is this that they talk of? What is a trauma-informed approach? Now, I can't teach it to you today in the slot that I have in just 15 minutes or so, but I can introduce you to the concept and give you some key but very important highlights around it. But first of all, let's talk about trauma. Many victims of different crimes experience trauma. This can be victims of human trafficking, domestic violence, other gender-based violence, sexual assault, child abuse, physical, mental, and sexual. People who experience violent physical assaults. All of these I've described have various forms of trauma on the victim. And we often find that within victims across many of these different crime types, there are common vulnerabilities. As a result of their trauma, they can suffer psychological harm as well as physical harm. But many suffer and experience coercive control. There are pre-existing vulnerabilities around poverty, destitution, conflict, refugees and displaced persons from Ukraine are one example, but conflict exists around the world. Domestic violence, victims that have disabilities, adverse childhood experiences are very common across a number of different types of victimology. And what do I mean by adverse childhood experiences? As the name perhaps suggests, it's things that children experience when they're young. And this includes domestic violence, abuse of parents being addicted to drugs or alcohol. And we often find that victims suffer from pre-existing learning difficulties as well. These are all common vulnerabilities that lead to a person being exploited or being victimised. But we need to understand trauma. So when bad things happen to people, we need to understand what is that traumatic effect likely to result in. We have to understand that victims of gender-based violence, human trafficking, all those different crimes I mentioned, are going to be traumatised. And one of the key aspects is that they are probably not going to want to have to keep repeating their experience. It's going to be really hard for them to tell a stranger what's happened. If they do it once, it's a huge deal for them. To have to repeat it again and again and again to different professionals means they are reliving that experience every time they retell their story. That adds to their trauma. Now, we're all humans and we all effectively work in the same way, and we certainly all have the same needs. And it's really helpful when we're dealing with victims and vulnerable people if we understand what these needs are. Now, there was a social scientist by the name of Maslow who created a hierarchy of needs, and I'm sure many of you are well practiced and know this. But Maslow set out his hierarchy of needs. What do humans need? And the first fundamental aspect that all humans need is physiological needs. We all need to eat, drink, sleep, be warm, and the same as any other species of animal on the planet, we need those aspects, we need those things before anything else. Once we have those, our next need is to feel safe. We need to have somewhere to sleep that's safe, somewhere to live that's safe, a safe community, safe environment, safety. Following on from safety, we have a need to be social. This is where we start differing from perhaps some other species. But we have a need to be social. There's a social hierarchy. We need to have people around us. We need to communicate with friends, family, and the like. From that comes self-esteem, and from that comes a feeling of self-worth and self-actualisation being at the pinnacle. When we're working with vulnerable people, victims that suffer trauma, we have to take care and ensure they have the physiological needs first, before we move on to safety. Are they fed? Have they had something to drink? Are they warm? Are they clothed? Have they got somewhere to stay? Then we can look at making them feel safe. And only then can we look at then introducing socialising and conversations that we wish to have with them around their experiences. But when we talk about adopting a trauma-informed approach, it's not just about the victim. It's about responsibilities that we as professionals have to ourselves, and for the managers that are present, it's about the responsibilities that we have to our staff. Because if you're in a situation as a professional where you're dealing with victims on a regular basis, you may well be hearing their stories, seeing the upset, sharing their experiences. And this will have what's known as the drip effect. It drips, it drips, it drips. Every day, you or your staff are experiencing more of the experiences of the victims. And just because we're professionals, just because we have a label to our position, does not mean we're not immune to human factors. And professionals need support as well. An example I have, very real life example within my professional career. I was in charge of roads policing for a large part of London. And like any country, the office of police officers dealing with roads policing deal with horrific incidents of vehicle collisions, people being hurt, people being killed. And there was an officer who had been very experienced, coming to a journalist service, been dealing with this for a very, very long time. And he had been brought to a situation of going to particularly traumatic and difficult incidents where a child had been fatally injured. And we have the phrase in English, the straw that broke the camel's back. And he couldn't take anymore. That was the last thing. The drip had been happening for years. And that made him himself ill and unable to function. So professionals need support. And we need methods of working, not to remove the trauma, but to reduce the transference of the trauma, to make sure that we are not affected ourselves with the trauma that we experience through other people. So what we're talking about, for both victims and professionals, is about adopting a trauma-informed approach. We have to, we're talking about the victims, the survivors. We have to establish and maintain a mutual relationship of trust with survivors. And trust is hard to win and can be easily broken. It's important, and these are just some highlights. These are top tips. It's important to be consistent and instill a sense of calm, security and safety. It comes back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Make sure people are comfortable, and we need to make sure they feel safe, and that we're calm and they feel calm. The difficult conversations need to be had, and we need to explain that to the victim, that we have to have this difficult conversation. But by pre-warning them, it allows them to have some confidence and to feel they have control over the situation. So many of these victims, control is something in their lives that they have had very, very little of at all. So it's better to give the control to them about how the conversation is managed and what they talk about at what speed is really important. And it's important that our staff do remain safe and well in their work. And like I said, avoid secondary traumatisation and professional burnout. So basically, it's quite simple. It's about what we do, how we do it, and equally, where we do it. Because that can set the scene for success or for traumatising, re-traumatising victims. So how do we do it? What's the basic theory? It's about showing empathy. Not necessarily sympathy, empathy towards the victims. It's about gathering trust. Not making promises we can't keep. When I'm teaching this as a full course, I always say to professionals, don't make promises you cannot keep. How can we, at that moment, promise someone that absolutely this will happen, or absolutely that won't happen? Your family will be safe in another country if it's a victim of trafficking situation. How can we at that moment say that? We can't, so don't say it. But we need trust. We need small gestures to build trust. And one of the most important aspects is to give the person time. Let them answer the question at their own pace. If they've been through a horrific, to us unimaginable situation, as many have, their brain needs to formulate their answer, needs to consider what they're going to say. Sometimes in an effort to try and protect themselves from their own experiences and memories. And we need to manage the time pressures to do that. Some of you may have experienced it, I'm sure you can imagine it. A professional going to interview, speak with a victim, and they say, look, I'm sorry I'm late, I'm really, really busy, I've only got a few minutes, so, let's make this quick. Or alternatively, they sit there, looking at their phone, checking messages, looking at the time. All of those aspects are devastating to a vulnerable person that's suffered trauma, because it basically tells them that person, the professional, doesn't care about me. So it's really important that we give a sense of time, and it doesn't matter how much you as a professional are under time pressures from your boss, you must not transfer that onto the victim. And of course, with managing the time comes managing the conversation. How we speak with the victim. And I say speak with and not to the victim. And with that comes cognitive interview skills, which I can't give you in this presentation now. It's a whole set of lessons in its own right. But basically it's a methodology of managing a conversation, because any interview or interaction with a victim, or in a law enforcement sense, witnesses or suspects, is a managed conversation. And there is methodology about how to do that. And part of that methodology is about how we set the scene. Where do we carry out this interaction? because it's important to make the victim as comfortable as possible. If you're working in a field, visiting an address perhaps, encountering a vulnerable person, as much as you can, you need to make sure that they're outside that exploitative situation. There's no point trying to engage if they're still within the environment where they're being exploited, like a domestic violence situation. Remove them from it. Make sure the setting is as informal as possible. 2 pictures on the screen, chair in a dirty room, overemphasising the point perhaps, but nonetheless making the point. And then we have a comfortable room with 2 comfortable chairs. It's the comfortable room you want to be speaking to the person in. And I'm sure you've experienced it as much as I have when we speak with victims and vulnerable people. Sometimes it's a basic room with a table and 2 chairs either side. The problem is that that table becomes a barrier. It's a barrier to communication because the victim sits behind it, they may adopt a defensive pose, but they're hiding behind the table. They're making their own safe space. You need to remove the table. Either choose a different location or physically move the table out of the room or turn it so that it's not between the 2 of you. Sit alongside a person rather than opposite them and use your body language to demonstrate openness. Opening our hands up, leaning forward, listening, using our hands, as I do a lot, to communicate. Because body language is really important, and that, as much as the words we say, make a person feel safe. And as I said, we don't rush them. Now, that is a very brief introduction to the concept of what is known as a trauma-informed approach to dealing with victims. But I do hope that just in the time that we have now, that it's given you an idea of the methodology of what is a trauma-informed approach, understanding the harmful effects that people experience. The fundamental principles are compassion and respect. And equally, that any form of professional communication with a person who has suffered trauma should be seen as an opportunity to move that person forward towards a long-term situation of safety and stability. But the one fundamental principle that must underline everything that we do in any situation in contact with a victim or potential victim is that we as professionals do no more harm. Whatever we do mustn't negatively impact or risk impacting the victim, because they've probably been through enough and they need to recover, and we need to do our best to get them to that safe place. So like I said, my apologies for being a short presentation, but I hope that's given you a small insight into the benefits of adopting a trauma-informed approach. Thank you very much indeed.